Program Director, Professor Somadoda Figeni, Chairperson of the Public Service Commission, and Commissioners, Mr. S.L. Zinoli, Deputy Speaker of Parliament, Professor Thuli Madonsela, Law Professor, University of Stellenbosch, and former Public Protector, Mr. B. Njanabangi, Country Representative, United Nations Population Fund, Directors General in attendance, Advocate Motibi, Special Investigative Unit, Advocate A. Johnson, Head Investigating Directorate, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Sanbonan. Dumelang. Thank you. It is for me a great honor and privilege to be part of this conference this afternoon and to have been invited to address you. I do hope that you had a very successful day yesterday as you deliberated on various topics under the theme, the cost of failure of governance and ethics in the public service, a response to the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, corruption, and fraud in the public sector, including organs of state. I take this opportunity to thank the Public Service Commission, the University of South Africa, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime for inviting me to be part of this conference. The program reflects my topic as, and I quote, reflecting on the impact of corruption on society and the role of the judiciary, close quotes. The conference takes place just over 5 months since I handed over the last parts of the report of the State Capture Commission to the President of the Republic on 22 June 2022. It also takes place just over a month after President Ramaphosa addressed the nation on his response to the State Capture Commission's report and recommendations on 23 October 2022. Interestingly, it also takes place on the 9th of December 2022, which is exactly 1 month short of 5 years since President Zuma announced the establishment of the State Capture Commission and my appointment as its chairperson on 9 January 2018. So 9 January 2023 will mark exactly 5 years since the appointment of the commission. For 3 years, from August 2018 to August 2021, South Africans were able to watch the proceedings of the Commission and to hear all the evidence on state capture, corruption and fraud in the public sector that was presented to the Commission, some of which was deeply shocking. It has been said that the Commission was a mirror in which we as South Africans were able to see ourselves. if the face we saw in that mirror was our face, then, quite frankly, we are ugly. Because in that mirror, we saw the real face of state capture, corruption, and fraud in our country. As I said, the program reflects that I must address you on the impact of corruption on society and the role of the judiciary. But I hope that, Professor Figeni, I will be forgiven if I use part of the time given to me to also deal with some of the matters that I think are important in addition to dealing with the matter that has been reflected in the program. When one wants to talk about the impact of corruption on society, it is easy for one to use the work of the Commission to talk about the impact of corruption on society. Because, as I have said, it's just over 5 months since I presented to the President the last parts of the report of the Commission. And I propose to refer to a few SOEs to talk about the impact of corruption on society. And it seems to me that probably the best place to start with, in the context of the evidence that was heard by the Commission, is at PRASA. PRASA is a very important state entity that was established in order to provide very essential transport to the people of South Africa, particularly poor people. But PRASA has not been able to provide a safe and reliable transport service to poor people in our country. And corruption and maladministration and incompetence and mismanagement have a lot to do with that inability. PRASA is that entity where, as corruption was raging over a number of years, the Portfolio Committee on Transport in Parliament, which had a constitutional duty to oversee what was happening at PRASA, was not interested in overseeing what was happening at PRASA, and was not interested in asking very pertinent questions in order to turn around the tide of corruption at PRASA. I'm saying nothing new from what I've said in the Commission's report on PRASA. PRASA is the state entity where a board that was committed to fight corruption found no support from the Portfolio Committee on Transport in Parliament. PRASA is the state entity where the chairperson of that board, who was determined to fight corruption and who is a veteran of the ruling party, went to the top 6 of the ruling party to say to them, corruption is rife at PRASA. I'm trying to fight it. Please help me. They did not help you. PRASA is the entity where a board that was fighting corruption took files and took them to the Hawks, many files, laid criminal complaints, and asked the Hawks to investigate corruption that had happened way back 2015, 2016. To date, the Hawks have not finished their investigation. PRASA is the entity where this board that I'm talking about, that was committed to fighting corruption, decided when they realized that the Hawks were not doing anything about the investigations, went to court to force the Hawks to do their job. And when they had left, nobody else seems to have pursued those efforts. PRASA is the entity where Professor Mdntv, as public protector, issued that report called Derailed, which contained numerous adverse findings about maladministration in that entity. But as at the time that I was writing my report, my information was that the recommendations that had been made in that report, or at least many of them, had not been implemented. Nobody seems to ask the question, why not? PRASA is the entity where for 6 years there was no permanent CEO. And the various ministers of transport seemed to have no problem with that. PRASA is the entity where after 6 years, a CEO was appointed in 2021, February or March. Then before the end of 12 months, he was suspended and later dismissed. When he took his dismissal dispute to arbitration, a retired senior judge of the Supreme Court of Appeal said there was no valid reason for him to be dismissed, and said it looked like there was some other agenda why he was dismissed, and he ordered that he be reinstated. He was not reinstated. He was then dismissed for another reason. Recently, I think an acting CEO has been appointed. Another acting CEO has been appointed. The question arises, why these very strange fissures at PRASA? PRASA is the entity where for 5 years irregular expenditure was going up it went up from 500 million in the first year, I think, up to about 20 billion after 5 years. And it was like there was nobody asking the questions, why do you not stop this expenditure? So the question arises, why is it that people who are supposed to see to it that PRASA operates properly are not doing their job? Because they don't do their job, the people suffer because corruption is continuing. Many of you would have heard recently that the Minister of Transport announced that it had been discovered that I think there were more than 3,000 or about 3,000 non-existent workers who had been on the payroll of PRASA, ghost employees. At this stage, I think it's not known how long PRASA may have been paying these ghost employees. Why is this all happening? Where was that money going? PRASA is that entity where the commission had evidence that an investigator, was an auditor, was trying to follow money that came from PRASA, was stopped by the Hawks from finishing his job. By the time the commission finished its work, it didn't know where that money ended because the Hawks stopped him. The effect and the impact of corruption at PRASA is seen and felt on the ground by ordinary people who need to use trains. I can refer to other evidence in the commission. Denel is one of the entities that the commission dealt with. Once upon a time, Denel was an envy of the world. It was run properly. It was respected internationally. And the chairperson of the board of Denel, which was in charge from 2010, 2011 to 2014, gave evidence which showed how well Denel was doing at that time. Then there was a new board in 2014, and then things changed. The commission's report deals with that, what type of people had been appointed there, and what happened. And of course, we know that Denel has had difficulties even to pay its own staff, its workers. That's how workers are feeling the impact of corruption and state capture at Denel. I can refer you to the 1 billion rand housing project in the Free State, where more than 500 houses were supposed to have been built. But in the end, the MEC who was in charge at the time for housing, Mr. Msebenzi Zwane, could not give any evidence which showed that more than 50 houses, to his knowledge, had been built. And yet, all the money had gone. The people who were supposed to be given houses were left without houses. I can refer you to the asbestos project of the Free State government, where Mr. Sodi's company was given the job of removing asbestos from houses in the townships without any processes being followed. And more than 250 million rand was paid, but there were no houses where asbestos had been removed. That's how corruption impacts on ordinary people. It affects their lives deeply. It affects their jobs deeply. But we know also from the Commission what happened at Transnet and what happened at Eskom. We know also what happened in the Free State, in the project, in the Free Dairy project. We know, for example, how local farmers in the Free State who were supposed to have benefited from that project were actually sidelined. We know how taxpayers' money was put at risk when the provincial government put 30 million rand into a company that had no experience in this type of job, that only had 16 rand in its bank account the previous day. We know how corruption at SAA has affected the people of South Africa. What happened at SAA is not something that happened overnight. It happened over a long period of time. And it's like people were supposed to keep an eye on whether SAA was working, were either asleep or were onto some other project, and they were not bothered by its decline year after year. Of course, until the provisional liquidation that happened. Through corruption, millions of rands meant for many are stolen by a few who are selfish, greedy, and who do not care about the welfare and the interests of the people. Unfortunately, some of those who participate in corruption in our country are those who pretend to be dedicated to the upliftment of the people. Money that is stolen from the people through corruption is money that would have been used to build schools, clinics, hospitals, roads, bridges, and generally to ensure development in our communities. Money that is stolen through corruption is money that could have been used to pay reasonable salaries for nurses, doctors, police, and other employees in the public service. It is money that could have been used to assist unemployed graduates and other young people to obtain training that would give them skills that could help them start small businesses. In our country, we still have mud schools in rural areas. We still have many schools that have no laboratories. We have too many schools which have no proper toilets. We have too many schools which do not have qualified maths and science teachers. We need to stop corruption so that money can be used to address these very serious needs in our society. In volume 3 of part 6 of the Commission's report, the Commission detailed various amounts, large amounts, which were paid out to the Guptas or their associates as part of state capture. That volume of the report reflects that an amount of over 57 billion rand was disbursed by organs of state in expenditure tainted by state capture. A complete breakdown is given in the report, and it was pointed out in the report that 97% of the total expenditure tainted by state capture related to Eskom and Transnet. All this money could have been used for the benefit of the people of South Africa. One cannot talk about the impact of corruption on society without talking about whistleblowers and about people who might not be whistleblowers in the true sense, but who made a significant contribution during the years that were reviewed by the Commission. People who resisted wrongdoing, people who resisted state capture, people who said no and risked losing their jobs and actually did lose their jobs. If we are to stand any chance of making a serious dent on corruption, we need to ensure that whistleblowers and those people who stand for what is right in the face of serious attempts at corrupting them and getting them to take part in corruption and state capture, they need to be protected. And we need to make sure that if, as a result of their efforts, the country recovers money that has been taken away from the people of South Africa through corruption, that they get some percentage of it. That is part of what the Commission has recommended. But corruption even undermines our constitutional democracy, our constitutional order. And allow me, Program Director, to read a quotation from a judgment of the Constitutional Court, which I think puts this better than I could have hoped to put it. This is what the court said, and I quote, "There can be no gainsaying that corruption threatens to fell at the knees virtually everything we hold dear and precious in our hard-won constitutional order. It blatantly undermines the democratic ethos, the institutions of democracy, the rule of law, and the foundational values of our nascent constitutional project. It fuels maladministration and public fraudulence and imperils the capacity of the state to fulfill its obligations to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill all the rights entrenched in the Bill of Rights. When corruption and organized crime flourish, sustainable development and economic growth are stunted. And in turn, the stability and security of society is put at risk. This deleterious impact of corruption on societies and the pressing need to combat it concretely and effectively is widely acknowledged in public discourse, in our own legislation, in regional and international conventions, and in academic research. Corruption is a serious threat to our fundamental rights. Corruption undermines our efforts to create an environment that will allow everyone to realize their full potential. Corruption compounds inequality in society. Corruption is a threat to society. Corruption must be fought wherever we see it. We must all come together to fight corruption and uproot it from society and from the workplace. The Constitutional Court also had this to say, and I quote, "Perhaps the fullest recital of the insidious scourge of corruption on society and the need to prevent and eliminate it is to be found in our own domestic legislation. The preamble to PRECA records that corruption and related corrupt activities undermine rights, the credibility of governments, the institution and values of democracy, and ethical values and morality, and jeopardizes the rule of law." That is part of the impact that corruption has in our society. And it is important that all of us must realize that corruption is an enemy of all those who envisage a society that is based on the values that are set out in our Constitution. Corruption ensures that a few become rich at the expense of the collective. At this stage, Program Director, allow me to digress a bit from the topic and say, when the Commission started, one of the primary questions that I was alive to was that if at the end of the work of the Commission was not able to come up with recommendations about what measures should be taken to make sure that state capture did not happen again, whatever else the Commission may have succeeded in doing would not be enough. Because after the end of the work of the Commission and looking back at the revelations that were made, all of us should say, this should never, ever happen again. But we must not mislead ourselves. We must not say it will never happen again when we don't have a clear plan that will make sure it doesn't happen again. We must never mislead ourselves and say it will never happen again if the foundation that provided a fertile ground to state capture in the first place is still there. We need to say, what are all of those things that made state capture happen, that facilitated it? Where did we go wrong? And it is important to point at certain people. We must also ask ourselves as individuals and as collectives and say, did we do enough? Because we all saw at different times what was happening. We also, maybe one saw today, another one realized in a week's time, in a month's time, or the following year, but at some stage we became aware. Some of us could have done something. We must ask ourselves, what is it that we could have done? And why should we not do it to make sure that state capture doesn't happen again? And the other question is whether if state capture were to happen, would we do the right thing? And on this, I would be very happy if Parliament is able to come out in due course and say, this is what we did wrong last time, which prevented us from stopping state capture when we could have. But this time, we will do things differently. Therefore, it won't happen again. That is very important. The ruling party also needs to ask itself questions. What is it that it should have done and didn't do, which enabled state capture to happen the way it happened? In the report, I referred to the meeting of the NEC where Mr. Mbalula stood up and very courageously told everybody about his conversation with one of the Gupta brothers when he said he was to be appointed as minister. And his evidence and the evidence of some of the people who were present amounted to saying, actually, he found no support. He found no support. And yet, he was saying there is a problem here. Three bosses of the State Security Agency approached the former president and the then Minister of State Security and said the Guptas must be investigated. They were not given an environment that allowed them to investigate. Maybe if they had been allowed, state capture might not have happened. The ruling party's own integrity committee, in 2013, this was Mr. Mantashe's evidence before the commission, issued a recommendation to the NEC of the ruling party that President Zuma should step down because it's clear that they could see what was happening. That recommendation was ignored. And if it had not been ignored, maybe state capture would not have gone as far as it did. So all of us need to say, what are the things that were not done right? What were the things that were done wrong? Would we be prepared and would we have the courage now to do the right thing? I will be very happy if Parliament were to nicely surprise me that if this was to happen again, they would stop it. But I would be very interested in how they would. And of course, I would compare with how it happened previously. I was also asked, Program Director, to talk about the role of the judiciary in the context of the impact of corruption on society. I believe that this question is asked in the context of what role the judiciary will play in the fight against corruption. This question must be answered first and foremost in the light of the primary role of the judiciary or the courts. The primary function of the courts and the judiciary is the adjudication of justiciable disputes. Therefore, the courts and the judiciary must carry out this function effectively and expeditiously as part of their fight against corruption. The expeditious and effective adjudication of disputes is paramount if the courts and the judiciary are to engender trust and confidence in society. In order for courts to do all of that, they must be adequately resourced in terms of judges, support staff, magistrates, tools of trade, and all necessary equipment. At the moment, there are many courts which have infrastructural challenges which need to be attended to in order to enable judges and magistrates to do their work effectively. There should be enough courtrooms, and vacancies must be filled as soon as possible so that courts will be able to rise to the occasion and play their role in the fight against corruption. Above all, the judiciary must adjudicate cases that come before the courts without fear, favor, or prejudice, and in accordance with their oath or affirmation of office, so that we never have a situation where there could be a reasonable suspicion that a judge or some members of the judiciary are captured by anybody, including corrupt elements in society. I know that there are some within society, our country, who like making unsubstantiated allegations that the judiciary is captured or that certain members of the judiciary are captured. The truth is that they've had about 4 years during the life of the State Capture Commission when they could have come forward with evidence, and nobody ever came forward with any credible evidence implicating a judge in corruption or state capture. A question may be asked what it means at a practical level to decide cases without fear, favor, or prejudice, and in accordance with our oath of office or affirmation. It means that, A, we will not bend the law in any case in order to achieve a particular outcome. The outcome of a case will be based on the Constitution, the law, and the evidence. The judiciary will not be scared to make unpopular decisions as long as those decisions are justified in terms of the Constitution, the law, and the evidence. We will not seek to enhance our popularity by giving outcomes for which we will be applauded when the Constitution, the law, and the evidence dictate that the outcome should be a different one. Members of the judiciary will grant bail to those accused persons who, in terms of the Constitution, the law, and the evidence before them, should be granted bail. Members of the judiciary will not refuse bail to any accused person who deserves bail because they would be unpopular, just because they would be unpopular if they released that accused on bail. Courts will convict or acquit accused persons depending on the Constitution, the law, and the evidence. Courts will sentence accused persons in accordance with accepted legal principles for sentencing. This is our pledge, and this is what we will do. In this way, we will play our part in the fight against corruption. We ask that everyone, including the legislature, the executive, civic and non-governmental organizations, do play their role in the fight against corruption. I do believe that with all of us working together, we have a chance of defeating corruption. I do believe that after the Commission has completed its task, we need to say, we're no longer going back. We will fight on. We will fight on until one day this country is free from corruption. Yes, it might not be 100% free of corruption because no country is completely free of corruption. But hopefully, one day, corruption in our country will be so insignificant that we will be justified in saying we have defeated corruption. Thank you.
Justice, I need to ask you to remain behind to sign the pledge.